Have you ever found yourself reacting to something in a way that surprised you? Maybe a sudden burst of anger, jealousy, or even fear that seemed to come out of nowhere? Or perhaps you've judged someone else harshly, only to realize, deep down, that their behavior mirrors something you don't like about yourself. These moments can be unsettling, but they offer a window into a part of ourselves that we often ignore or avoid. It's a part of us that lurks in the shadows, quietly influencing the way we think, feel, and act. The shadow self is an idea that resonates with everyone, even if we don't call it by that name. It's the hidden part of us, the aspects of our personality that we'd rather not acknowledge, our fears, insecurities, desires, and impulses. It's the part we keep tucked away, not just from the world, but often from ourselves. And yet, despite our best efforts to suppress it, the shadow has a way of showing up, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. What makes the shadow so fascinating is that it's not inherently bad or wrong. It's not some monster lurking in the corners of our psyche, waiting to ruin our lives. In fact, it's a natural and essential part of being human. The shadow exists because we're complex, multifaceted beings. As we grow and learn, we develop a sense of who we are or who we think we should be, and along the way, we push aside the traits and feelings that don't fit that image. Over time, these rejected parts of ourselves collect in the shadows, forming a hidden side of our personality. But here's the thing, just because we ignore the shadow doesn't mean it goes away. In fact, the more we try to suppress it, the more it influences us. It can shape our behavior, often without us realizing it, and it can show up in ways that feel confusing or even destructive. The shadow isn't something we can simply lock away and forget about. It's always there, and the more we understand it, the better we can navigate its influence. The idea of a shadow self isn't new. For centuries, philosophers, poets, and psychologists have explored the concept of the hidden or unconscious side of human nature. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, famously popularized the term shadow, describing it as the unconscious part of our personality that contains everything we've repressed or denied. But the shadow isn't just a psychological concept, it's a deeply personal experience. It's the part of us that holds our vulnerabilities, our contradictions, and our untapped potential. What's truly fascinating is how the shadow shows up in everyday life. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to point out flaws in other people? Maybe you've been annoyed by someone's arrogance, laziness, or need for attention. But sometimes, if we're honest with ourselves, those qualities bother us because they're reflecting something in our own shadow, something we don't want to admit. It's called projection, and it's one of the ways the shadow makes itself known. By noticing what triggers us in others, we can start to uncover what's hiding in our own psyche. The shadow can also appear in moments of emotional intensity. Maybe it's an unexpected burst of anger or jealousy that feels out of proportion to the situation. Or maybe it's a deep sense of insecurity or self-doubt that seems to come out of nowhere. These reactions can feel overwhelming, but they're not random. They're clues, pointing us toward parts of ourselves that we've been avoiding. But the shadow isn't just about things we dislike about ourselves. It also holds qualities that can be positive. Sometimes we push away traits like confidence, ambition, or creativity because we've been taught they're too much or not acceptable in certain situations. Over time, these positive aspects of ourselves get buried along with the negative ones, leaving us feeling incomplete or disconnected. The shadow isn't just a repository for our flaws, it's also a treasure chest of untapped potential. What makes the shadow so powerful is its ability to influence us without our conscious awareness. It can shape the way we see ourselves, the way we interact with others, and even the decisions we make. Left unchecked, it can lead to patterns of behavior that hold us back or cause unnecessary conflict. But when we take the time to understand and integrate our shadow, it becomes a source of insight, growth, and even strength. Understanding the shadow isn't about getting rid of it or trying to fix ourselves. It's about embracing all parts of who we are, the good, the bad, and the messy in between. It's about shining a light on the hidden corners of our psyche and learning to navigate them with curiosity and compassion. Because the truth is, the shadow isn't something to fear, it's something to explore. It's a part of what makes us human, and by understanding it, we can unlock a deeper sense of self, awareness, and authenticity. The journey of exploring the shadow is deeply personal, and it's not always easy. It requires honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront parts of ourselves that we'd rather not see, but it's also incredibly rewarding. By facing our shadows, we can break free from patterns that no longer serve us, heal old wounds, and step into a fuller, more authentic version of ourselves. So, as we begin this exploration, let's approach it with an open mind and a sense of curiosity. The shadow is a mystery worth unraveling, not just because it helps us understand ourselves better, but because it connects us to something universal, the shared complexity of being human. And maybe, just maybe, by embracing our shadows, we can find a little more light in the process. The shadow self, just the phrase itself, feels a bit mysterious, doesn't it? It's a concept that's been explored for generations, particularly in psychology, philosophy, and even art. But what exactly is it? Simply put, the shadow self represents the parts of ourselves that we don't want to acknowledge or accept. It's the hidden, often uncomfortable side of our personality, the traits, desires, and impulses that we bury deep down because we're taught they don't belong in the light. To understand the shadow self, we need to look at how it forms. From the moment we're born, we start to learn about the world and what's considered acceptable behavior. We absorb messages from our families, schools, communities, and cultures about what's good and what's bad. These messages aren't always explicit, but they shape us in powerful ways. Maybe you were told not to cry because big kids don't cry. Or maybe you were scolded for being too loud or too assertive. Over time, we start to push these parts of ourselves away, tucking them into a metaphorical shadow. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who popularized the concept of the shadow, described it as the unconscious side of our personality, the dark side, not because it's evil, but because it's hidden. According to Jung, the shadow holds everything we reject about ourselves. It's like a storage room in the back of our mind, filled with all the things we've labeled as unacceptable, embarrassing, or shameful. But here's the catch. Just because we've pushed these parts into the shadow doesn't mean they go away. They stay with us, influencing our thoughts, feelings, and actions in ways we might not even realize. So, what kinds of things end up in the shadow? It's different for everyone, depending on their upbringing, culture, and personal experiences. For some, the shadow might hold feelings of anger or jealousy, emotions they were taught were bad or unacceptable. For others, it might include traits like selfishness, laziness, or fear. But the shadow isn't just about negative qualities. It can also hold positive traits that we've rejected for one reason or another. Maybe you were told that being ambitious was greedy, or that being creative was impractical. Over time, you might have buried these parts of yourself, even though they could be sources of strength and fulfillment. The shadow self is tricky because it operates in the unconscious. That means we're often unaware of its influence, but it has a way of making itself known, especially in moments of stress, conflict, or intense emotion. Have you ever found yourself overreacting to a situation or feeling irrationally angry at someone? That might be your shadow peeking through. Or maybe you've noticed that certain people really get under your skin, even if they haven't done anything particularly wrong. That's often a sign of projection when we attribute qualities we dislike in ourselves to someone else. It's the shadow's way of pointing out what we've hidden away. Projection is one of the most common ways the shadow shows up in our lives. It's like holding up a mirror, but instead of seeing our own reflection, we see the traits we've rejected in ourselves reflected in others. For example, if you find yourself constantly annoyed by someone's arrogance, it might be because a part of you fears being seen as arrogant, or maybe you've buried your own confidence. The shadow works in subtle ways, often revealing itself in the things that irritate, frustrate, or even fascinate us. But the shadow isn't something to fear or avoid. In fact, it's an essential part of who we are. Without the shadow, we wouldn't be whole. It's like a puzzle. Every piece matters, even the ones that are difficult to fit into the bigger picture. Jung believed that integrating the shadow, acknowledging and accepting these hidden parts of ourselves was a crucial step in personal growth and self-awareness. He called this process shadow work, and it's not about getting rid of the shadow, but learning to understand and work with it. The idea of the shadow self can feel heavy or even uncomfortable at first. After all, who wants to confront the parts of themselves they've been avoiding? But what's incredible about this process is how liberating it can be. When we face our shadow, we start to see ourselves more clearly. We begin to understand why we react the way we do, why certain situations trigger us, and why some patterns in our lives keep repeating. It's like turning on a light in a dark room. You can finally see what's been hidden and start to make sense of it. What's important to remember is that the shadow isn't inherently good or bad. It's simply a part of you, shaped by your experiences and perceptions. The traits in your shadow might have been labeled as negative at one point, but that doesn't mean they have to stay that way. For example, assertiveness might have been discouraged when you were younger, but as an adult, it could be a valuable tool for setting boundaries and advocating for yourself. By bringing these traits out of the shadow, you can reclaim them and use them in a healthy, constructive way. One of the most powerful things about understanding the shadow self is how it can deepen your relationships, not just with others, but with yourself. When you start to recognize and accept your shadow, you become more compassionate and less judgmental. You realize that everyone has a shadow, and everyone is grappling with their own hidden struggles. This understanding can help you approach conflicts with empathy, see others more clearly, and build stronger, more authentic connections. The shadow self isn't just a psychological concept, it's a doorway to self-discovery. It invites us to look beyond the surface and explore the depths of who we are. It asks us to be honest with ourselves, to confront the parts we've been avoiding, and to embrace our full complexity. It's not always an easy journey, but it's one that leads to greater self-awareness, personal growth, and ultimately, a richer, more fulfilling life. So, what is the shadow self? It's you, the parts of you that you've hidden away, the traits and feelings you've labeled as unacceptable. But it's also a source of insight, strength, and potential. By understanding the shadow, you can begin to unlock the full spectrum of who you are, embracing not just the light, but also the darkness, and finding harmony in the balance between the two. The shadow self, hidden and tucked away in the unconscious, doesn't stay silent. It has a way of making its presence known, often when we least expect it. The tricky part is that we don't always recognize it for what it is. Instead, the shadow tends to sneak up on us, showing up in our reactions, relationships, and patterns of behavior. These moments can feel confusing or even frustrating, but they're actually opportunities to glimpse the parts of ourselves we've pushed aside. So, how can we tell when the shadow is at work? One of the most common ways is through emotional triggers. You know those moments when someone says or does something that sets you off. Maybe it's a comment that feels sharper than it should, or a situation that stirs up an outsized reaction. These intense feelings are often a sign that your shadow is being poked. The shadow holds the parts of ourselves we don't want to face. And when someone or something touches on those parts, it can feel deeply uncomfortable. For example, imagine you're in a meeting and a colleague confidently shares an idea. Instead of admiring their boldness, you feel irritated or even angry. On the surface, it might seem like they're being arrogant or taking up too much space. But if you dig a little deeper, you might realize that your reaction has more to do with your own shadow. Perhaps you've buried your own confidence because you were taught that being assertive wasn't acceptable. Seeing someone else embody what you've repressed can trigger a strong emotional response, even if you don't realize why. This process is called projection, and it's one of the shadow's favorite tricks. Projection happens when we unconsciously attribute our own hidden traits or feelings to someone else. It's like holding up a mirror, but instead of seeing our own reflection, we see those traits in the people around us. This can show up in all kinds of ways: judging someone for being selfish, dismissing someone as overly emotional, or envying someone's ambition. Often the traits we react to in others are the very ones we've suppressed in ourselves. But projection doesn't just reveal what we've buried, it also shows us where we can grow. If you find yourself consistently annoyed by certain qualities in others, it's worth asking, could this be something in my own shadow? What am I rejecting about myself that's being reflected back to me? These moments, while uncomfortable, are invitations to explore the parts of ourselves we've left in the dark. Another way the shadow reveals itself is through patterns in our lives. Have you ever noticed that you keep encountering the same types of situations or challenges? Maybe you've had a series of relationships that all seem to end for similar reasons, or you've struggled with the same conflict at work over and over again. These patterns aren't random, they're the shadow's way of getting your attention. When we ignore or repress certain aspects of ourselves, they tend to show up in repeated experiences until we're ready to face them. For instance, someone who has buried feelings of unworthiness might find themselves in relationships where they feel undervalued or taken for granted. Or someone who has suppressed their anger might attract situations that continually test their boundaries. These patterns can feel frustrating, but they're not meant to punish us. They're signals. They're clues that point to unresolved parts of our psyche, asking us to look more closely and take steps toward healing. Self-sabotage is another hallmark of the shadow in action. This can take many forms, from procrastination to perfectionism to staying in situations that don't serve us. Often these behaviors stem from unconscious beliefs or fears that we've buried in the shadow. For example, someone who avoids pursuing their goals might have a hidden fear of failure or even a fear of success that keeps them stuck. The shadow thrives on these unexamined fears, influencing our actions in ways we don't fully understand. The shadow also has a way of showing up in relationships. Interpersonal dynamics are fertile ground for the shadow's influence, because relationships often bring out our most vulnerable and deeply rooted emotions. Conflicts, misunderstandings, and even intense attractions can all be driven by shadow projections. For instance, you might find yourself drawn to someone who embodies qualities you've repressed, or you might clash with someone because they reflect a part of yourself you don't want to acknowledge. This is why relationships can feel so emotionally charged. They're mirrors for our shadows. The people we're closest to often hold up those mirrors most clearly, whether they're friends, family, or romantic partners. While this can lead to conflict, it can also be a powerful opportunity for growth. By recognizing how the shadow plays a role in our relationships, we can start to navigate those dynamics with greater awareness and compassion. Dreams are another place where the shadow likes to make an appearance. Our unconscious mind speaks to us in the language of dreams, often revealing hidden aspects of ourselves through symbols, images, and scenarios. If you've ever had a dream that left you feeling unsettled or confused, it might be your shadow trying to communicate. Pay attention to recurring themes or characters in your dreams. They can offer valuable insights into the parts of yourself that you've been avoiding. Of course, recognizing the shadow's influence isn't always easy. It requires a willingness to be honest with ourselves and to look at parts of our psyche that might feel uncomfortable. It also requires patience. Shadow work is a gradual process, not something that happens overnight. But the rewards of this work are immense. By identifying the signs of the shadow in action, we can begin to understand ourselves more deeply and take steps toward healing and integration. The shadow isn't something to fear or fight. It's a part of who we are, and it has valuable lessons to teach us. When we pay attention to our triggers, projections, patterns, and dreams, we can start to uncover the hidden parts of ourselves and bring them into the light. This doesn't mean fixing or eliminating the shadow. It means learning to embrace it as an essential part of our humanity. As we continue to explore the shadow self, it's important to approach this work with curiosity and compassion. The signs of the shadow in action might feel challenging or even uncomfortable, but they're also opportunities for growth, self-awareness, and transformation. By shining a light on the shadow, we can begin to understand its role in our lives and use that understanding to create deeper, more authentic connections with ourselves and with others. Relationships are some of the most rewarding yet challenging experiences we have in life. They teach us about love, trust, and connection, but they also bring to the surface parts of ourselves we might not want to face. That's because relationships are like mirrors. They reflect not only our best qualities, but also our hidden shadows. And often, it's in these intimate connections that the shadow has its strongest influence. When we enter a relationship, whether it's romantic, familial, or platonic, we bring our entire selves to the table. Not just the parts we're proud of, but also the parts we've tucked away. These hidden aspects of our psyche, the ones we've repressed or denied, don't disappear just because we ignore them. Instead, they tend to seep into our interactions, sometimes in ways that feel confusing or even damaging. One of the most common ways the shadow shows up in relationships is through projection. Projection happens when we unconsciously assign our own hidden traits, emotions, or desires to someone else. For example, imagine you're annoyed by a friend who seems overly controlling. On the surface, it's easy to label them as the problem. But if you dig deeper, you might realize that your irritation stems from your own discomfort with control, either because you fear being controlling yourself or because you've suppressed your own need to assert boundaries. Projection doesn't always show up as judgment or irritation. It can also take the form of admiration. Have you ever been drawn to someone because they seem to embody qualities you wish you had? Maybe they're confident, creative, or adventurous. That attraction might be a sign that those same traits are lying dormant in your shadow, waiting to be reclaimed. The shadow isn't just a repository for the negative parts of ourselves. It also holds our untapped potential. Another way the shadow influences relationships is through emotional triggers. You've probably experienced moments where someone's words or actions hit a nerve, sparking an intense reaction that feels disproportionate to the situation. These triggers are often clues that your shadow is at play. For instance, if you feel a surge of anger when a partner forgets something important, it might be worth asking whether that anger is really about the forgotten task, or whether it's tied to a deeper wound, like a fear of being overlooked or undervalued. The shadow also has a way of creating patterns in our relationships. Have you ever noticed that you keep encountering the same types of conflicts, no matter who you're with, or that you're drawn to a certain type of person, even if the relationship doesn't serve you? These patterns are often the result of unresolved shadow dynamics. For example, someone who feels unworthy of love might unconsciously seek out relationships where they feel neglected or taken for granted, reinforcing their hidden belief. The shadow thrives on these cycles, repeating them until we're ready to confront what's beneath the surface. But the shadow doesn't just influence our conflicts. it also plays a role in how we connect and bond with others. When two people enter a relationship, their shadows don't stay hidden. They interact, sometimes clashing, sometimes complementing each other. This interplay can create a powerful dynamic where each person's shadow draws out parts of the other that might otherwise remain dormant. In a healthy relationship, this can lead to growth and self-discovery. In a toxic relationship, it can create a cycle of blame, projection, and misunderstanding. One of the shadow's most subtle impacts on relationships is the way it shapes our expectations. When we carry unexamined shadow traits, we often expect others to fill the gaps or compensate for what we've denied in ourselves. For instance, someone who has suppressed their need for independence might become overly reliant on a partner, expecting them to provide constant reassurance or support. Conversely, someone who has buried their vulnerability might expect their partner to always be strong and unshakable, leaving little room for authentic connection. Recognizing the shadow's role in our relationships can be uncomfortable, but it's also incredibly empowering. When we become aware of our projections, triggers, and patterns, we gain the ability to step back and examine what's really happening. Instead of reacting defensively or assigning blame, we can ask ourselves, what is this situation teaching me about myself? What part of my shadow is being revealed, and how can I work with it? This kind of self-awareness can transform the way we relate to others. By owning our shadow, we take responsibility for our emotions and behaviors, rather than expecting others to fix or accommodate them. This doesn't mean we stop having needs or boundaries. It means we approach those needs and boundaries from a place of clarity and authenticity. We stop looking for others to complete us and start building relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. Another benefit of embracing the shadow in relationships is that it allows us to see others more clearly. When we recognize how projection works, we can approach conflicts with empathy, understanding that the traits we judge in others often reflect something within ourselves. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior, but it does mean approaching it with curiosity rather than judgment. Similarly, when we admire someone, we can see that admiration as an invitation to explore and develop those same qualities within ourselves. Of course, integrating the shadow in relationships isn't easy. It requires honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront parts of ourselves that we'd rather avoid. It also requires open communication with the people we're close to, creating space to share our struggles, fears, and aspirations. This kind of openness can be uncomfortable, but it's also deeply rewarding. By acknowledging our shadows, we create room for genuine connection, not just between ourselves and others, but also within ourselves. Ultimately, the shadow's impact on relationships isn't something to fear, it's something to embrace. The challenges it creates are opportunities for growth, teaching us more about who we are and how we relate to the world. By working with the shadow, we can build relationships that are not only more authentic, but also more fulfilling, rooted in a deep understanding of ourselves and each other. In the end, relationships are one of the most powerful tools for shadow work. They hold up a mirror to our hidden selves, revealing the parts of us that long to be seen, understood, and integrated. By approaching these moments with curiosity and compassion, we can transform our relationships into spaces of healing, growth, and profound connection. And in doing so, we take one step closer to becoming the fullest, most authentic versions of ourselves. Embracing the shadow self is one of the most transformative journeys we can take. It's not about fixing ourselves or getting rid of the parts we don't like. It's about acknowledging that every part of us, even the ones we've hidden or rejected, has value. The shadow isn't our enemy. It's a part of who we are, and when we learn to work with it, it can become a source of incredible insight, growth, and strength. But what does it mean to embrace the shadow? First, it requires us to be honest with ourselves. We have to be willing to look at the parts of our personality that we've ignored, denied, or suppressed. This isn't easy. It can be uncomfortable to confront the things we've spent years avoiding, but it's also liberating. By shining a light on the shadow, we begin to understand why we react the way we do, why certain patterns keep showing up in our lives, and why we sometimes feel disconnected from ourselves. One of the first steps in embracing the shadow is to cultivate self-awareness. This means paying attention to our emotional triggers, the things that irritate, frustrate, or upset us. These moments are like breadcrumbs, leading us to the parts of our psyche that need attention. For example, if you find yourself feeling jealous of a friend's success, it might be worth asking, what is this jealousy trying to tell me? Is it highlighting a fear of inadequacy or a buried desire for success? Instead of dismissing or judging these feelings, we can approach them with curiosity and compassion. Another powerful way to explore the shadow is through journaling. Writing down our thoughts, feelings, and experiences can help us uncover patterns and connections that we might not notice otherwise. Journaling provides a safe space to express the parts of ourselves that we might not feel comfortable sharing with others. It allows us to examine our shadow traits without fear of judgment, creating an opportunity for self-reflection and understanding. Dreams are another valuable tool for shadow work. Our unconscious mind often communicates with us through dreams, using symbols and scenarios to bring hidden aspects of ourselves to the surface. If you notice recurring themes or characters in your dreams, take some time to reflect on what they might represent. Dreams can offer profound insights into the shadow, helping us see the parts of ourselves that are asking to be acknowledged. Shadow work also involves recognizing and reclaiming the traits we've disowned. Sometimes, these traits are things we've labeled as bad or unacceptable, like anger or selfishness. But these qualities aren't inherently negative. They're part of being human. For instance, anger can be a powerful motivator for change when expressed constructively, and a healthy sense of self-interest can help us set boundaries and take care of our needs. By integrating these traits, we can use them in ways that serve us, rather than allowing them to control us from the shadows. But the shadow doesn't just hold the traits we dislike, it also holds our untapped potential. Sometimes we suppress qualities like creativity, ambition, or confidence because we've been taught they're too much, or because we're afraid of failing. Embracing the shadow means reclaiming these parts of ourselves and allowing them to shine. It's about giving ourselves permission to be fully who we are, without fear of judgment or rejection. One of the most profound aspects of shadow work is how it deepens our compassion, not just for ourselves, but for others. When we recognize our own shadow, we become more understanding of the shadows in others. We see that everyone is carrying their own hidden struggles, and we approach conflicts with empathy rather than judgment. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior, but it does mean acknowledging the humanity in everyone, even in their imperfections. Embracing the shadow is also a path to greater authenticity. When we integrate the parts of ourselves we've denied, we stop pretending to be someone we're not. We become more comfortable in our own skin, more confident in our choices, and more connected to our true selves. This authenticity isn't about being perfect. It's about being whole. It's about showing up as we are, with all our strengths and flaws, and trusting that we are enough. Of course, shadow work isn't a one-time process. It's a lifelong journey. As we grow and evolve, new aspects of the shadow may come to light, but this is a good thing. It means we're continuing to learn about ourselves, to deepen our self-awareness, and to move toward a more integrated and fulfilling life. The shadow isn't something to fix or get rid of. It's a companion on the path of self-discovery, guiding us toward growth and transformation. It's important to approach shadow work with patience and self-compassion. The process can be challenging, and it's okay to take it one step at a time. Remember that the goal isn't to eliminate the shadow, it's to understand it, to work with it, and to integrate it into the larger picture of who we are. By doing this, we can turn what once felt like a source of pain or confusion into a wellspring of wisdom and strength. As we embrace the shadow, we start to see the beauty in our complexity. We realize that being human means holding both light and darkness, both order and chaos, both strength and vulnerability. And in that balance, we find a deeper sense of connection, not just to ourselves, but to the world around us. So, how do we begin? By being curious, by asking questions, by approaching ourselves with kindness and a willingness to explore. The shadow isn't something to fear. It's a part of us that longs to be seen, understood, and embraced. And when we take the time to do that, we discover a deeper, richer version of ourselves. One that's more whole, more authentic, and more at peace. The journey of embracing the shadow is one of the most rewarding paths we can take. It's a journey towards self-awareness, growth, and transformation. And as we walk this path, we come to see that the shadow isn't a burden. It's a gift, waiting to be unwrapped. It's a reminder that we are not just the sum of our light, but also of our darkness. And that, in embracing both, we find the true essence of who we are. As we reach the end of this exploration into the shadow self, it's clear that the parts of ourselves we've hidden away are not as scary or unmanageable as we might have thought. In fact, the shadow holds the key to some of our most profound growth and self-discovery. It's a part of us, a part that, when embraced with honesty and compassion, can transform our understanding of who we are and how we navigate the world. The shadow self is not something to fear. It's something to learn from. It's a reminder that we are complex, multifaceted beings, and that even the parts we've repressed or judged harshly have value. By looking at our triggers, recognizing our projections, and identifying the patterns in our lives, we can start to see the shadow not as a flaw, but as a vital part of our humanity. What makes shadow work so transformative is its power to deepen our relationships, not just with others, but with ourselves. When we embrace the shadow, we stop running from our imperfections and begin to understand them. We become more compassionate, not only toward ourselves, but also toward the people around us. We see that everyone carries their own shadows, and that these hidden parts are what make us human. This awareness helps us navigate conflicts with empathy, strengthen our connections, and build a more authentic sense of self. But shadow work isn't just about understanding, it's about integration. It's about taking the parts of ourselves that we've pushed into the darkness and bringing them into the light. It doesn't mean glorifying our flaws or letting destructive patterns take over. It means accepting all parts of ourselves, recognizing their purpose, and learning how to work with them in ways that serve us. When we integrate the shadow, we stop being controlled by it. Instead, we become whole, grounded, and empowered. The journey of shadow work is deeply personal, and it's not always easy. It requires courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths about ourselves. But it's also incredibly rewarding. By facing our shadow, we unlock new levels of self-awareness, discover hidden strengths, and step into a more authentic version of ourselves. We learn to trust our complexity, to honor our experiences, and to embrace the fullness of who we are. As we close this chapter, I invite you to reflect on your own shadow. What are the traits, emotions, or desires that you've pushed aside? What triggers or patterns might be pointing you toward something hidden? And most importantly, how can you approach these parts of yourself with curiosity and compassion rather than fear or judgment? Shadow work is a lifelong process, and it's one that evolves as we grow and change. But every step we take toward understanding and integrating the shadow brings us closer to a life of authenticity, balance, and fulfillment. It's a journey worth embarking on, not just for ourselves, but for the relationships we build and the impact we have on the world around us. If this exploration of the shadow self has resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What parts of yourself have you discovered through shadow work? How has embracing your shadow helped you grow? Share your experiences in the comments below. I'm always inspired by the stories you have to share. And if you found this video thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a like. Share it with someone who might benefit from this journey. And subscribe to the Storyteller Panda for more explorations into the mysteries of the mind, the universe, and everything in between. By supporting the channel, you're helping to create a space where we can all learn, grow, and connect. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadow self. Remember, the parts of you that you've hidden away are not something to be ashamed of. They're part of what makes you human. Embracing your shadow isn't about perfection. It's about wholeness. It's about stepping into the fullness of who you are and finding beauty in the balance of light and dark. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep exploring the depths of who you are. You are so much more than the sum of your parts, and every step you take towards self-awareness brings you closer to the incredible, complex person you're meant to be.